Hey there, Lincoln Douglas folks. It is June 2021. NSDA Nationals is right around the corner, and I sort of owe you a little bit of an apology. June has been a crazy busy month for us here at MSU, and for me in particular. Nothing bad going on, nothing problematic, just a lot of work on our plates. And I have not had time to put together the full-length, like hour and a half or whatever video that I would normally like to do on every topic. I feel really bad about it, but when I looked at my notes, I realized we still had some pretty good information on the public health emergency topic, on things like framing and definitions and some cards and empirical arguments. And so I thought it would still be useful, even though we can't put together a full-length video, to take some time and take what we have and put it into maybe 8 or 9 tips on how to be successful in approaching the resolution for NSDA Nationals this year, which is, of course, resolved. A public health emergency justifies limiting civil liberties. So that's what we're going to do. Rather than a full-length video where we divide it up into sections, I'm just going to progress through 8 or 9, maybe 10 tips, and they're more or less going to follow our usual order. Things like an overview of how the tournament works, framework definitions, some app arguments, and then some neg arguments. And hopefully you'll find it useful because, after all, you guys are the best of the best. You're the ones who've made it to NSDA Nationals. You don't need us, frankly, to write the case for you. And so if you find 1 or 2 ideas in here that are useful to you, hopefully that's better than nothing. And we really appreciate you being cool with this because, frankly, I never anticipated that a May and June would be quite as challenging as it has been for us. So with that, we will jump right into it, and we'll get started with the first tip, which is that you really need to know how NSDA Nationals works, right? If you've never been to NSDA before, which is statistically the case with most people are first-time qualifiers, you need to understand this is different from other big national tournaments. The judging pool is incredibly diverse. You tend to have more lay people and more parents judging than at your typical big national circuit type tournaments. Now, to be fair, are there technical judges? Are there first-year out debaters and coaches? Absolutely. Read the paradigms on tabroom.com as soon as you know who's judging you, right? Always make sure that you do that. But overall, in terms of the mix of judges, you have to anticipate that you're going to get a lot more lay-friendly, non-technical folks than you typically see at a tournament like this. And so it pays to prepare your cases and to prepare your rebuttals because, while you can absolutely win some rounds by, going fairly fast and being fairly technical, if you do that over the course of a long tournament, you're going to lower your odds of getting that key swing ballot from a non-technical judge. And in a tournament that goes 15 or 16 rounds, right, you cannot force your way through it. You have to play the odds, and you have to get a little bit lucky to stay in. So as a practical matter, how do you approach preparation? Just a few basic tips. First of all, and this is probably the most important thing, plan to keep your delivery at a moderate pace. Say more with fewer words, right? You don't have to cut the substance, just say more with fewer words. So if you have like a paragraph long block quote, well, read the 2 sentences that matter and then have the rest of it available if you're challenged or if you need it for context, right? But editing and cutting the fat out of cases is your friend to let you keep the content, right, but scale back on the time, right? In addition to that, practice the delivery of your case. And maybe even if you can, practice a full debate. That may be difficult, but if you can, in front of non-technical folks, parents, non-debater friends, to make sure that they look at what you're doing and they see it as being a good, solid, rhetorically sound speech that regular people can understand, right? In addition to that, make sure that your case, and also ideally your blocks and rebuttals, tell a story. What you don't want to be doing is getting up and just moving quickly through jargon. Contention 1 is targeting minorities, and then you just immediately go into reading this really dense card at high speed, right? Tell a story. Explain the contention. My first contention is that limitations on civil liberties in an emergency overwhelmingly burden minorities and disenfranchised groups. Dr. Carl Smith in 2020 explained, right? Read it like a speech, right? Like a good extemporaneous speech, not just following kind of the norms of more circuit-style debate. And then also in your rebuttals, make sure that you're covering the flow, but also taking some time to come back to the big picture. A lot of these non-technical judges don't have like really well-developed sort of paradigms in terms of how they evaluate rounds, what the technical issues are for them. So they're really waiting in many cases for debaters to say, look, here's what really matters here. How do you weigh all this? What are the key points that let you cut through all the noise and feel confident in your decision? Well, let me tell you, right? They are waiting for somebody to explain the decision calculus, because in many cases, they haven't spent their whole life thinking about what their decision calculus is. They're smart, educated people. It's just that's not what they do with all their time. And then lastly, and most importantly, don't be a jerk, right? I think if you watch this channel, you know this is our highest priority, right? Judges of all stripes, judges from all backgrounds, of all levels of knowledge, really want to try to give the round to the person who's not a jerk, who's not, belligerent, if they can possibly justify it, on the flow and on the substance, right? That's even more true with parent judges and non-technical judges who are not maybe as acclimated to kind of the rough and tumble of debate. So no matter what, be the side that is keeping cool and not getting baited into like snippy little fights. If you watch the finals of NSDA and if you watch the out rounds that you can find sometimes on NSDA's website, right, you will see that this is what the debaters who are making it into the late out rounds are doing. They are smart people. They understand debate theory. They understand, the technical side of debate, but they are adapting it, right, to a more layperson friendly audience, and they're doing a really good job of it. So make sure you take the time to get ready to focus your case on the NSDA style of debating, which is its own distinct thing, right? Second big point is that I think definitions on this topic have the potential to be pretty important. And the reason is that you have two objects of evaluation in public health emergency and civil liberties that are both so broad, right, that it is really hard to make any single categorical statement about how they interact. So we're going to talk about that interaction between them in our next point. But before we can do that, we need to know a little bit about what the actual definitions of these terms are and what some of the examples are. So let's start with these two major terms, public health emergency and civil liberties, and then we'll move on to the others, right? So public health emergency. Well, this is really a vague legal term of art, right? It has a specific legal meaning in various, types of law, right? And what it boils down to is that when you call something a public health emergency or designated a public health emergency under law, those are sort of the magic words that you have to say to trigger special emergency powers for governments in the United States on the state and federal level, right? And in other countries, on whatever level is applicable. I will tell you that I would not use the United States federal definition of a public health emergency in the round on either side, because it actually does not contain a definition of what a public health emergency is. It just sort of assumes that we all know what it is, and then it talks about the powers that are allocated to the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Also, on the federal level, a designation of a public health emergency is more about things like money, right? Allocating money and funding to things like treatments and vaccines. It's not the same thing as declaring a disaster. So if you look at the definition when we pop it up on the screen here, you'll see that under the section of the federal code that actually talks about public health emergencies, number one, you're not going to get a definition of what the emergency is. And number two, you're not going to see anything about civil liberties, emergency powers, anything along those lines, right? Because it's really more about spending money in ways that you could not normally spend money on, things like buying vaccines, entering into contracts, right? So I definitely would not use that if it were, if it were up to me. State laws, U.S. state laws are actually much more on point here, right? They're about things like the governor of a state being able to limit travel or suspend public assemblies, right? And so we're starting to talk more about things that look like civil liberties, right? And there's a very good summary of how these state public health emergency laws operate from Haffajee and others in 2014. This is a New England Journal of Medicine article on the various definitions of a public health emergency. And it explains how the standard for what constitutes a public health emergency actually varies widely. And so the relevant quote is, state laws providing public health emergency powers permit designated officials, typically governors and their top health officers, to take extraordinary legal actions. State laws vary in their definitions of emergency or disaster. Many refer to an occurrence or imminent threat of widespread or severe damage, injury, loss of life, or property resulting from a natural phenomenon or human act, right? Some mention only the magnitude of the potential harm, not its source. Others, including the Massachusetts law, provide no definition, leaving it to the governor to determine what constitutes an emergency, right? To sum it all up, the article explains public health emergencies this way. The spirit of emergency powers laws seems to enshrine three key criteria for suspending normal lawmaking processes. Number one, the situation is exigent. Number two, the anticipated or potential harm will be calamitous. And number three, the harm cannot be avoided through ordinary procedures, right? And that may actually be the best, clearest definition I've found, because if you pick any one particular governmental definition, it's going to conflict with 20 others, right? And they are substantively very different from one another, right? So that may may be, even though it is somewhat vague, the least bad definition you can find, especially since it comes from a very credible source in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it tries to summarize what these emergency powers laws are in general, right? What that means, though, and this is really important for your understanding, is that public health emergencies are not limited to things like pandemics or infectious diseases or even to medical issues generally. They are basically defined as being something that's really bad and unusual that has happened, and we need to do something about it now, and we can't wait for the usual legal processes, or the damage will be really, really calamitous, right? As we're going to discuss in a few minutes, that's a really vague definition that gives the government a huge amount of power with very little clear definition as to when the power is conferred, when it terminates, or what its limits are, right? Now, in terms of specific examples, even though I would probably not use the federal public health emergency definition in a round, the federal use of public health emergencies in the last 20 years is something that's well documented, and it does give you a decent idea and some examples of how broad this term can be. So if you take a look at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services website, they have a list of declared public health emergencies over the last 20 years, and the first thing you think when you see it is, wow, there are a lot of these things. And they include everything from COVID-19 to the opioid crisis. In other words, the existence of the use of opioids. Drug abuse exists, and that's a public health emergency, right? They include various hurricanes and their aftermaths, wildfires, a 2018 earthquake in Alaska, the 2017 Zika virus outbreak, various tornadoes, 2011 flood in South Dakota, the H1N1 swine flu outbreak in 2009, and this is my favorite, the 2009 inauguration of President Obama. So as you can see, these are all over the place in terms of severity, from COVID, which has killed more Americans than World Wars I and II combined, down to a tornado that might have casualties in the dozens or maybe 100, to a virus like the swine flu that, while serious, killed fewer people than the regular flu. So the question is, and we're going to come back to this in the next point, how do you establish a general moral or ethical statement or standard about a concept that is so all over the place that it could potentially include near extinction level events like, say, the bubonic plague, if it recurred right today, all the way down to a particularly contentious presidential inauguration, right? So moving on to the next term, similarly broad, is civil liberties. Now there's a good summary of this in FindLaw, which is kind of a good layperson-friendly online, encyclopedia about legal issues, and it just says civil liberties concern basic rights and freedoms that are guaranteed either explicitly identified in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution or interpreted or inferred through the years by legislatures or the courts. Now, this is specific to the United States, right, because it refers to the Bill of Rights, but it's talking about the basic rights and freedoms that are enshrined in sort of the core laws, typically the Constitution of whatever country you're talking about, right? Examples of civil liberties, according to FindLaw, include things like free speech, privacy, the right to remain silent during police interrogation, the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures of your home, right to a fair trial in court, right to marry, and right to vote. Now, if you look to other sources, for example, there's this piece, and I will admit it is on study.com, so it's not an academic source, but it is from two PhDs in Mark Percy and Leslie Chappell, so you could cite them as two PhD experts on American history. But they include other things like, and this is important, the right to bear arms, the freedom of the press, the right to legal counsel, the right to peaceful assembly, which is critically important in, for example, a pandemic, and the right to travel freely. And of course, if you want to back these up, you can go out and find scholarly sources declaring that each and every one of these is a civil liberty, right? If you want to have something more, authoritative maybe than FindLaw, you can go and Google right to travel, civil liberty, and you will find a scholar who says that that's what it is, right? But here again, the range of these things is incredibly broad, right? And how much each one of them can be limited is also incredibly broad. So we could be talking in this debate about anything from a fairly mild limit on like the number of people at a public gathering, like in on a public square on a street, all the way down to just like complete martial law, locking people in their houses, suspending free speech to quash criticism of the government's response, which has actually happened in some places during COVID. So here again, how do you make categorical statements about a concept that is that broad? Well, again, we're going to come back to that in a minute. But first, let's take a quick look at some of the other terms in the resolution. So first is justifies. I think justifies is potentially relevant because one argument the AF might consider is that by using the term justified, the resolution lowers the affirmative burden somewhat because being justified does not require that a response be ideal. Rather, it only requires that the response meets some minimum standard of moral acceptability, right? So for example, if you look at Webster, you'll see several definitions of justified, including to prove or show to be just, right, or reasonable, right? And to show a sufficient lawful reason for an act done. And so what AF would argue is, I only have to show that this limitation on civil liberties is reasonable and that there is some sufficient reason for it, not that each and every limitation you can come up with is necessarily ideal. So the analogy I use for the word justified in debate resolutions is this. It's a student is justified in punching a bully in the mouth. Right? That doesn't require us to say that punching the bully is ideal. It doesn't require us to reject the idea that there might be better solutions. It might be that going to the teacher is a better solution and letting them solve it. But if punching is still within the realm of responses that we would say is permissible, then it is justified. So the AF would say this is a lower threshold than like a strict utilitarian calculus. So if the negative, runs a case that says, well, limiting civil liberties doesn't work very well, the AF would say, well, that's not the question. The question is not whether this is the best solution, merely whether it is one of several possible justified solutions, which goes to a point about the tool in the toolbox theory, which I'll talk about in just a minute. The next term is limiting. Not going to read definitions here, they're very easy to find, but this is just another term where the app probably wants to try to limit or reduce their burden, right? Limit is a different concept than to eliminate, remove, overturn, prohibit, or any other absolute word. So if I'm the app, I probably want to be ready to argue that I am not responsible for defending like outrageous, complete denials of civil liberties that we're going to talk about later in the video. All I have to defend is some state of the world where something less than the complete scope of civil liberties exists for some defined period of time. What I don't have to do, I do not have to defend every crazy, poorly thought out removal or revocation of rights that you find in places like Slovakia or Bangladesh or Ethiopia when these rights are absolutely removed or ignored. All I have to do is defend certain limitations. And in a few minutes, we're going to talk about how specifically AF might choose to frame these limits by using standards from things like international organizations to try to sort of take control of exactly what the word limit means in the debate. But for now, just be aware that the term limit potentially gives AF some wiggle room on its burdens. The last definition I want to talk about is the word A, as in a public health emergency. Another argument the AF might raise to reduce its burden is to argue that the indefinite article A, right, by using this, the resolution permits the AF to just pick one public health emergency, like presumably COVID, but it could really be anything, and run an advocacy solely based on that, because it's just a public health emergency. It's not all public health emergencies. And in so doing, the AF would say they have the right to limit the round to just that example. Now, if you want to try doing that on the AF, it's not a ridiculous interpretation. It might be a way to allow you to limit the round to COVID, and if you can pull it off, it could certainly help you limit the scope and keep the debate better defined, right? But you should just be aware that there is a different way to interpret the use of the word A here, and in my view, linguistically, frankly, it is a better interpretation, and it does not, or it would not allow for this kind of narrow advocacy. And the source on this is a blog post from, I think their name is Chemsai Thong and Griesbach, who are grad students at the University of Washington. They have a blog post on the use of articles in the English language that we will link to. And what they talk about is the use of a singular form noun with the indefinite article a or an. And so as you can see on the screen, what they're talking about here is a sentence in which you start with the indefinite article a or an, and then you have a noun, and then what it does is it describes the characteristics or the components or the elements of something. And what they say is that basically that doesn't refer to any single version of the noun, right? Any single example of the noun. It applies to basically all types of the noun. And what they're basically saying here, I've written it down so I can say it clearly, is that when a sentence starts with a singular noun and the indefinite article a, and then it describes the characteristics, it is not an invitation to pick one example of that noun. Rather, it is a statement that applies to all examples. So, for example, as they say here, an essay has three main parts. A bicycle has two wheels, right? These are statements that apply to all things in the category of essay or bicycle. So, for my own example, if you said a square has sides that are 3 feet long, most people who know about geometry would say that's inaccurate and a misleading statement. right? Because while there certainly is some square out there with 3-foot long sides, the phrasing "a square has" strongly implies that you are about to describe an essential characteristic of squares, right? Similarly, the negative here would say that the phrase "a public health emergency justifies" strongly implies that you are about to describe a necessary element of all public health emergencies. So under that view, no affirmative, you don't just get to pick your favorite public health emergency. You have to show that justifying limiting civil liberties is a characteristic that is common to the entire class of things that we call public health emergencies, right? Now, this may or may not come up. It probably won't come up in most rounds, but if you are the negative, it is a thought that you might want to put in your back pocket in case you run into an app that says, no, we're only debating COVID here, or God forbid, we're only debating, the Spanish flu here, or some other very esoteric example, and you say, no, that's not what the word "a" means. You have to address the class of public health emergencies, not just one. So that leads to a framing question. This is the next big point in the video, right? Which is the key framing question for me on this. And this is the single biggest point in the video. So if you want to stop watching, you can stop watching after this. And that is this question: which side wins the debate when the answer is "it depends"? Okay, and let me explain what I mean with that. Which side wins when the answer is "it depends"? Most rational, everyday people are going to look at this resolution and they're going to think, well, you can't answer it with absolutes, because the range of things described by the two terms public health emergency and civil liberties is so broad that it just isn't susceptible to any single answer. Public health emergencies range from potential extinction level events down to like cleaning up after a tornado hits a small town, or a relatively innocuous disease like the swine flu. Civil liberties range from, again, total suspension of the Constitution or whatever the basic law is in a country, arbitrary arrest, silencing dissent, all the way down to like temporary travel restrictions and relatively modest limits on public assembly. Any reasonable person, almost any reasonable person, is going to say that temporary bans on large public gatherings are justified if a country is facing like an apocalyptic outbreak of something like the Black Plague or like the disease from Stephen King's The Stand, right? Similarly, any reasonable person is going to say, conversely, that suspending the entire Constitution, letting the police run amok and lock people in their houses during something like the 2009 swine flu, which killed about 12,000 people, is not acceptable. So given that reality, right, that 98% of judges will instinctively, as a matter of common sense, conclude it depends on the specific circumstances. It depends on what the emergency is and what the limits on the civil liberties are. It becomes imperative for debaters to answer a basic question that is rooted in logic and debate theory, which is who wins when the judge basically feels like, well, it kind of depends, right? This is going to be key. I think higher level debaters who really engage with this and answer this are going to have a big advantage in the round, because almost every judge is going to feel this way. So the neg will argue, I win, right, when the answer is it depends, because the resolution is a categorical statement. It is not limited by qualifying terms like most or some. You as the affirmative have the burden of proving that this statement is either absolutely true or at least generally true. And later on in the video, I'm going to lay out a negative argument on this that basically says, look, judge, because the public health emergency and civil liberties are so wide-ranging, you just can't know what you're voting for. If you vote for the app, you are basically signing a blank check to engage in action that could be justified, or it could be totally unjustified. And there is no way for you to know what you're voting for and what you're endorsing with an app ballot, because again, public health emergencies are so broad and civil liberties are so broad and the potential limits are so broad and so vague that you're just really rolling the dice. And that is not something you can do as an ethical decision maker. And I've actually kind of made the argument there, but we'll come back to it in more detail later. So that's going to be the next argument. They have to give you a clear picture of what you're actually endorsing here and a general categorical rule that you can always feel comfortable with. And because it depends so heavily on what, the emergency is and other things, you can't do that. The affirmative is going to argue conversely, no. When the answer in your mind, judge, is it depends, I win for several reasons. First of all, there's several ways you can do this. Number one, they might say the word A lets me just pick a public health emergency, right? So I can pick COVID and just run a case about COVID. Number two, they'll say the word justifies means it's just within the bounds of morality, not necessarily the best option, so I have a lower standard there. But I think the best argument that the AF can make is one that I've actually seen used at NSDA, which is the tool in the toolbox framing, right? This is a common sense sort of logical, it's not really a theory that you can cite a philosopher for, it's just a common sense way of phrasing what the AF's burden is in a debate round. And again, I've seen it used actually in the national finals at NSDA and at other tournaments like NCFL recently. So the tool in the toolbox framing is this. What you basically say is, look, Judge, it is literally impossible for any debater to show that any given policy response is always going to be correct, no matter how it's applied in every case. So for the sake of fairness, right, the AF's job is to just show you that limiting civil liberties should be one tool in our toolbox for responding to a public health emergency. I don't have to argue that it should be used in every case. I couldn't possibly argue that. That's just not possible within the scope of a debate. It's not logically possible. All I have to do is show you, the only fair burden on me, right, is to show you that it is one option in appropriate cases. Tool in the toolbox is a pretty nifty, useful framing tool for layperson judges and even more technical judges. As I said, I've seen it used in some big tournaments, including NSDA, but the basic idea is, Judge, there's no way for human beings to make absolute categorical statements about any action, any policy, to say it's always justified. That's just not how the world works. You can't even categorically say that like killing innocent people is wrong, because you have things like the trolley dilemma where you pull the switch and make the trolley go in a different direction to kill fewer people, right? So the fair real world question you should ask for the AF is the same question that real world policymakers ask. Not, should we always restrict civil liberties, or should we just say that every possible restriction on civil liberties is justified? That's ridiculous. No real person in the real world asks that question. Rather, you should be asking yourself, should we have these limitations as one tool in our toolbox? And if that is the question, right, if that's the only question, then you don't have to defend all the weird outlier cases where like Uganda is going and rounding up LGBTQ people in the name of COVID, right? And that's why you should vote AF. So speaking of AF, let's move to some of the AF points that I had in my notes, some of which I think are pretty good. The first one is also kind of a framework thing, but it also is in some sense a substantive argument, and that's the idea that the AF may want to advocate for limitations that comply with a specific ethical framework. And the framework I'm thinking of is the one outlined by the World Health Organization in 2007. And let me explain what I mean. I really do think the AF should strongly consider going ahead at the beginning of the case and trying to take control of what the limits on civil liberties will look like, rather than just leaving it up to the negative or the judge's imagination, right? And one really good way to do that is to define limits by reference to some concrete real-world rule on how these limits on civil liberties work in a public health emergency. And a great option for that comes from the World Health Organization in 2007. It's a document called Ethical Considerations in Developing a Public Health Response to Pandemic Influenza. And here's what it says. This is the money quote. It's a 6 or 7 page document that has lots of specific points about how to limit civil liberties and other ethical considerations. But what it says is, in emergency situations, the enjoyment of individual human rights and civil liberties may have to be limited in the public interest. However, efforts to protect individual rights should be part of any policy. Measures that limit individual rights and civil liberties must be necessary, reasonable, proportional, equitable, non-discriminatory, and in full compliance with national and international laws. So the framing argument that the AF would want to use here is, look, by using the term limit as opposed to something like abolish or ignore, that means that the affirmative is required to give you, as the judge, some kind of rule or principle that tells you what these limits will look like, right? How can these limits be these liberties be fairly scaled back during a public health emergency, but not eliminated? In this round, I'll be advocating for the limiting principles set forth in the World Health Organization's 2007 paper, Ethical Considerations in Developing a Public Health Response to Pandemic Influenza. In other words, I, as the AF, have not just the right, but really an obligation to give you some sense of how these limitations should be structured. You can call it a plan, you can call it an advocacy, you can call it a definition of the word limit, but the bottom line is I cannot be asked to defend any possible limitation that could ever exist, so I'm within my rights to give you a framework, and here's the framework I'm giving you. Right? How does this affect the round? Well, the core idea is that this potentially allows the AF to eliminate pretty much any negative rights violation scenario by arguing that it doesn't meet at least one element of the WHO standard, right? You say it's not necessary, it's not proportional, it's not equitable, it's not non-discriminatory, it's not compliant with existing laws. So, for example, if negative talks about Uganda rounding up LGBTQ folks due to COVID, right? You respond by saying, no, I don't have to defend that. That's not the kind of limit that I'm defending. defending, right? Because it's not, number one, non-discriminatory, it's not equitable, and it's not compliant with international law. If the negative talks about a country banning dissent, right, about some government action, again, it's not compliant with international law, it's probably not proportional or necessary. And I basically say I am defending a certain model of limitations, which is the limitations outlined by the World Health Organization. You can't force me to defend any crazy limitations that these authoritarian countries or non-democratic countries are implementing, right? If you're going to run something like this, I think it's a good idea, right? If you're going to run something like this to try to take control of what limit means, it certainly would be helpful to be conversant in how civil liberties can actually be restricted under U.S. law. So you'd want to have some sense of how we actually restrict civil liberties under U.S. law, which we're going to talk about in just a second. And also, of course, you should read the entire WHO 2007 paper so you can explain just exactly how it advocates limiting these limiting principles and how they come into play on a practical level so they don't sound unrealistic, right? So with that, we actually move to another point on the affirmative, which is, and directly related, which again, not an empirical point so much as a thematic point, which is that we limit civil liberties all the time, right? You want your judges to be in this frame of mind where they don't reflexively think of limitations on civil liberties as being these like extreme, like martial law type events, because they are not, right? Governments around the world and in the United States specifically impose reasonable temporary limitations on civil liberties all the time. As a lawyer by trade, someone who practiced constitutional law before becoming an administrator here at MSU, I can give you examples. So free speech is arguably the most important civil liberty. It's the key to all the others. But under well-settled Supreme Court precedent, governments are free to impose restrictions on the time, place, and manner of public speech. So, for example, here on this university campus, we are required to allow people to come on our campus and speak on pretty much any topic. But we can impose restrictions on that right as long as they are content neutral and they deal with the time, place, and manner. So, for example, we can and do prohibit like loud, amplified speeches using like a bullhorn near classrooms. We can prohibit large assemblies during exam week when people are studying for exams, right? We can prohibit large gatherings inside our classroom buildings. If we're hosting a big SEC football game here, we can tell you that your large protest can't happen today. You're just going to have to wait for another day, right? Police in big cities can shut down assemblies that block traffic. City governments can require advanced permits and shut down protests if they get above a certain size if they can show that it poses safety concerns. They can impose curfews and prohibit protests and gatherings at certain times of night. They can create buffer zones around places like abortion clinics where you're not allowed to go and protest in the name of public safety. And we're going to link to a couple of straightforward summaries of how these limitations work. One is from the ACLU of Illinois in 2015. Another is from Gelton, I think that's how you say the name, in 2021, summarizing, legal limits on freedom of assembly. But the basic takeaway is that these limits are imposed every single day, even without a public health emergency or really any emergency. They're just part of how the U.S. Constitution works, and you can find analogies to them and examples of similar restrictions on civil liberties in every democratic country in the world. And there are other limitations on civil liberties too. For example, there are emergency exceptions to the Fourth Amendment's prohibition on warrantless searches. So, for example, if the police have reason to believe that a terrorist suspect is making a bomb inside a private residence and is going to set it off, well, guess what? They can go search without a warrant, right? That person's civil liberty against a warrantless search is limited. And again, you didn't need a public health emergency, although I guess a bomb probably would be one of those, right? If a child has been kidnapped in a certain area and police want to try to keep the suspect from leaving with the child, one thing they can do is go set up like roadblocks, and they can stop cars and question drivers without any particularized Fourth Amendment suspicion. So again, we limit civil liberties all the time. It's just how democracy works, and you really need to get judges used to the idea that limiting civil liberties is just part of how governments work. You have to trust your government to do it in a fair way, which is why using, for example, the WHO standard is a good idea. You have to trust them to follow their own rules and to have courts that can review it. But the idea of limiting them in and of itself should not be controversial. We do it all the time. Now, if I'm the negative and I hear this, I need to be prepared to hit back and say that the AF needs to defend something more than these regular restrictions that already exist in the day-to-day world, right? I might argue that these really aren't limitations on civil liberties, these day-to-day things that happen, all the time. These are just the contours of how civil liberties are defined in the first place. So, for example, if I'm the neg, I would say that, the rule that you can't use a bullhorn to protest at 2 a.m. in a residential neighborhood is not really a limitation on free speech. Rather, what I would say is you never had that right to use the bullhorn at 2 a.m. in the first place, right? A limitation, if I'm the neg, I would say the AF has to advocate for limits that are not part of the generally acceptable set of rules that we apply all the time. These have to be unique, new limitations that only come about as a result of public health emergencies, not the basic things like, you can't go screaming through a residential neighborhood at 2 a.m, right? They have to be new, additional things that you would not normally be able to do, right? Things like travel restrictions, quarantines where people have to stay in their homes, restrictions on criticizing the government's response to COVID, things along those lines. The next half point I have is that most people in democracies agree with reasonable restrictions on rights during a public health emergency. And this just goes to the broader theme of normalizing the idea of restrictions on civil liberties. This comes from Stancheva, 2020. This is a Harvard professor of economics. And what they point to is empirical research on polling of how people respond to the idea of sacrificing civil liberties during COVID. And what they say is, to determine where people stand on these issues around the world, my colleagues and I have conducted large-scale representative surveys of more than 370,000 respondents and counting in 15 countries at various phases of the COVID-19 pandemic. Overall, about 80% of respondents are willing to sacrifice at least some of their own rights in times of crisis. Overall, recent surveys suggest that most people around the world are indeed willing to sacrifice at least some of their civil liberties in the name of public health. Even in liberal democratic strongholds, most people do not view civil liberties as sacred values that must be upheld in all circumstances. And what this shows is that the real debate among real people in the real world actually affected by COVID, which is the biggest public health emergency in recent history, is really not whether civil liberties can be restricted. The debate that's being had is when and to what extent. Nobody's really debating about whether. And here's one thing that you can do as you go through and Google sources on the negative, right? And you're looking for arguments on the negative. One thing that you would do if you're smart is note that in almost every source I saw on the negative, at some point the author gives a caveat and says, of course we don't disagree that sometimes civil liberties have to be restricted in an emergency. I mean, really, when you read law review articles and other things like that, pretty much every responsible author will acknowledge that. So, one thing that you can do is prepare to respond to specific cards and specific authors, but another thing that you can do is just point out that all of these authors, even these authors that are really skeptical of certain limitations that have occurred, all of them tend to acknowledge that some restrictions on civil liberties have to happen. I mean, we can't have people packing football stadiums when the bubonic plague or, its equivalent or COVID, right, is spreading across the country, right? And really, this just comes back to the basic core theory for the AF, which is that there's literally no way you can have a functioning society that isn't able to restrict certain civil liberties in emergencies. And you want to be talking about, in terms of things like large assemblies, barring huge sporting events, barring super spreader events, temporary limits on the occupancy of businesses, and maybe temporarily restricting travel to and from countries with uncontrolled spread and no vaccines. And if you agree with these basic innocuous things, the things that are actually happening in the real world, Judge, focus on what these big developed countries are doing, you should be voting for the affirmative, right? Now, switching over to the negative side of things, the arguments here that I found are a little bit more on the substantive side of things, right? So the first one I have is that public health emergencies create a pretext for bad illiberal regimes to more or less permanently erode rights and attack disenfranchised groups, right? So the first point is that public health emergencies have resulted in unnecessary rights restrictions during COVID, just as a matter of empirics. And this is also from Stancheva in 2020. And what she notes is the think tank and watchdog organization Freedom House found that since the start of the pandemic, the condition of democracy and human rights has worsened in 80 countries, with particularly sharp deterioration in struggling democracies and highly repressive states. According to The Economist, governments have understandably assumed understandably, right? Even this acknowledges that it's understandable. But governments have understandably assumed emergency powers to deal with the crisis, but have also abused them by selectively banning protests, scapegoating minorities, and perhaps taking advantage of the fact that the world's attention is focused on issues other than human rights. Examples of these abuses are abundant. So this comes from Levine in 2021, dealing with civil liberties limitations during COVID. And it just talks about how, of the 193 members of the United Nations, many have imposed very significant restrictions. And it gives examples like the Slovak military in Slovakia quarantined 5 Roma settlements that had not yet hit the requisite infection threshold established by the government, so discriminating against Roma citizens. At least a dozen journalists in Bangladesh are facing life sentences for publishing criticism of the government's response, and the legislatures in Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Zambia have been dissolved on account of the pandemic, just getting rid of the legislative process entirely. It also talks about Hungary and Poland. Hungary passed a set of regulations that give the government the right to issue special emergency decrees, and the Polish Ministry of Health banned consultants and epidemiologists from expressing their views on the virus or the reaction of public health authorities to the pandemic, right? These acts can be seen as examples of a global trend. 61% of countries have imposed at least some problematic restrictions on individual rights or democratic processes during the pandemic, and 17 countries have made substantial negative changes. So these are just examples and empirics about how this is going on under COVID. It is not something hypothetical. It's not something remote. It's what's happening in the real world, right? The next point is that emergency powers are likely to be used to further oppress marginalized groups. So the first, and there are plenty of examples of this. I'm just going to give a couple. You can absolutely find numerous articles on this. The first one is the Ugandan use of COVID to harass and arrest LGBTQ individuals. So this is from Nyoni 2021 in the Harvard Human Rights Journal, talking about Uganda targeting LGBTQ persons. And what that says is, while these new emergency powers are framed as a response to the pandemic, they've been wielded by law enforcement to excessively target sexual minorities because of their real or perceived sexual orientation and gender identity, under the thinly veiled guise of enforcing the presidential directive, and in violation of the constitutional prohibition on arbitrary detention. The Ugandan authorities raided a known LGBTIQ shelter and arrested 23 men on spurious charges of breaching the coronavirus restrictions. Then it goes on to talk about how these men are facing up to 7 years in prison. They've been denied basic legal process. It's just a really egregious example of how we use these restrictions as a pretext. You don't want to, of course, lean exclusively on examples like Uganda. So another good example would be Trump's use of an emergency declaration to build his border wall. Now, while Trump didn't specifically refer to the emergency as a public health emergency, most people don't use that exact term of art. In his executive order about the emergency use of funds to build the border wall, Trump cited the influx of illegal narcotics and cramped conditions at holding facilities for migrants as the justification for unchecked executive power to basically take money out of the budget that was not budgeted by Congress for the wall and use it to build the wall, right? And so there are a million different ways to tell this story, right? But what you want to be doing is pointing out to the judges that these abusive restrictions are common, they're widespread, they're happening in all different types of countries, and they are targeting overwhelmingly, minorities and disenfranchised groups for things as wide-ranging as, pressing people in Uganda, but also, these sort of racially biased policies in the United States, right? Another negative point is that unreviewable power to declare a public health emergency means that these rights are essentially an illusion, right? So now that we've established that public health emergencies can be used as a pretext for repression, let's go back and look at what that means for how the judge should vote in the round. And if we look to the article we talked about earlier from Haffajee and others in the New England Journal of Medicine, remember how the article talked about how public health emergencies are not really well defined in the law, and sometimes they're not defined at all. Well, if you look at this chart with a few sample public health emergency laws from various states, you're going to notice two things, right? First of all, the powers are incredibly broad. They let you do things like controlling freedom of movement, commandeering private property, right? In Washington, you have the power to exercise powers without regard to procedures or formalities of law, basically just suspending all law. The government can potentially ignore any law that it finds inconvenient. And secondly, you'll notice the definitions of what the emergency has to be, right, are incredibly vague. A couple of these laws have really vague definitions that seem to give the governor the power to act if he or she decides the situation is really dangerous. But two of the four, Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, they don't even have definitions. In other words, the governor essentially has unfettered authority to decide when they have authority to ignore the law. And so the argument would be, look, if your rights and your civil liberties are basically totally discretionary, if they can be taken away or restricted or removed by the executive or the political branches of the government, and you have no legal recourse, you don't even have a definition, what could a court do? There's no standard for what an emergency is, so there's no way to enforce your rights, right? Well, if that's the case, Are they even really rights at all? If something can be taken away on a whim, when the concept is poorly defined of why you're even doing it in the first place, is that even really a right at all? And the argument would be, again, as we mentioned earlier, Judge, when you sign your ballot for these civil liberties limits in a public health emergency, you don't know what you're authorizing. It could be something reasonable, like, restricting big crowds during a deadly pandemic, or it could be rounding up LGBTQ folks in Uganda, or suspending the entire legislature in Ethiopia, or imprisoning journalists in Bangladesh. It could be a bona fide real crisis like COVID, or like a major natural disaster, or it could be building a wall on the border in response to a ginned up, racially motivated immigration issue, right? In other words, Judge, the AF should have to show you that when you pull the trigger and you go into this public health emergency AF world, that you have necessarily, or at least in the overwhelming majority of cases, met some kind of substantive standard for being just or moral or whatever their value is. And they need to show you what that is, right? But what we're seeing is when we go into the public health emergency world, we have no idea what we're getting. We have no idea whether that standard is met. We're just rolling the dice on these two super vague terms, public health emergency and civil liberties, and we're hoping that we come up with a situation that's morally defensible. But because those terms are so broad, you don't know which end of the spectrum you're going to get if you vote AF. And moreover, as a practical matter, in the real world, because the legal definitions of terms like public health emergency, right, are so vague, there's no practical real world assurance that rights will be protected either, right? And in that situation, Judge, where you don't know what the moral calculus that you're voting for is, you cannot morally vote AF. AF is asking you to write a blank check to any regime, any government, good or bad, to just do what it wants. It's asking you to roll the dice and hope that the public health emergency will be serious and the civil liberties limits will be reasonable, and that it won't be one of the bad cases. But you cannot ethically write a blank check to violate civil liberties when you don't know what the violation will be. You cannot simply roll the dice on fundamental rights, and you can't therefore vote to affirm. And I think this is a powerful, intuitive argument. If you don't know what the rights violations will be, and you don't know what the justification for them will be, you cannot write a blank check, Judge, and that's what the affirmative is asking you to do. And I think that's a pretty strong intuitive argument. Last argument on the negative is that sound policy making during a crisis requires more freedom of information, not less freedom of information. And the basic idea here is that on balance, we should oppose civil liberties restrictions during emergencies because they stifle the free flow of information, right? During an emergency, it's necessary to respond quickly, but it's also necessary to get accurate information on what's happening and who's being impacted. So for example, during COVID, it's important to listen to epidemiologists, but you also have to balance the risks that epidemiologists identify with the harms, for example, that small business owners and economists and regular citizens identify. How badly are they being hurt economically? How are their lives being disrupted? Is the cure in some cases potentially worse than the disease? And the only way you can get that information reliably is to protect civil liberties. And this comes from Levine in 2021. And here's what he says. Considering that making good policy in a pandemic means balancing incommensurable goods under conditions of uncertainty and limited control, how should governments decide? Science certainly has a role, but no empirical evidence or algorithm can determine how to balance potentially competing goods like individual liberty versus public health. We need a broader conversation than merely a scientific one. Leaders must be compelled to give the public evidence and reasons for their decisions, and a wide range of citizens must be free to criticize the state, defend various goods, and present alternative policies. Robust debate is more, not less, important during a crisis when the potential for making dangerous errors is most severe. In a classic paper, Amartya Sen noted that no democracy has ever permitted a famine. Sen argued that the reasons included the free flow of information during a food crisis, reliable data about what is happening on the ground, and accountability. These same arguments should apply in a health crisis such as a pandemic. Now, obviously, this doesn't address every type of limitation right on public health emergencies. That's almost impossible. But what it does do is give a general compelling reason for a judge to default away from civil liberties limits to keeping public discourse open. Because if you want to know how badly people are hurting, you have to let them speak, right? You have to let them go and frankly try to open their business, right? To try to go and buy things at the grocery store, to travel and see what the harms are, and then to report back and argue, look, maybe we don't need to have restrictions that are quite this severe. Maybe we need some, but in other cases we don't need to have them. So because it's hurting us economically, right? So the default, the heavy default should be, right, to the idea of having fewer restrictions and weaker restrictions or no restrictions at all, right? So with that, those are just a few thoughts that I had, a few notes that I made, a little bit more of an abbreviated video. I'm sorry it was limited, but hopefully some of it was useful to you, at least maybe some of the concepts and definitions. Congratulations on making it to NSDA. Best of luck. If this is your senior year, I hope debate has been as great an experience for you as it's been for me. I hope you've made friends. I hope you're better informed, better prepared for all the things life's going to throw at you. And if you're coming back next year, well, we'll see you then in August. But regardless, we've had a great year. Really appreciate you being along for the ride with us. And so we'll end with what we always say here, which is remember, debate is for everybody. So work hard, have fun, and hail state.